WSRE presents Food for Thought, in-depth presentations on political, social, and cultural topics. In December 2009, Dr. Ruby Payne spoke on the subject, What Every Church Member Should Know About Poverty. Her presentation took place at Olive Baptist Church in Pensacola and was sponsored by United Gambia's Poverty Solutions faith-based team.
It's a pleasure for me to be with you, and I always like to start with a story. I work with a church in Waco, Texas, and I went there to work with them, and the women of one of the Sunday school church classes came up to me at break and said, "We have to tell you what happened." I said, "What is it?" She said, "Well, we had this young lady from the community college coming to church, Wednesday morning Bible study, and we just loved her. And they realized that she was coming on the bus to come to Bible study. So that all the ladies got together and they bought her, pulled their money, got $2,500 for a car, and they bought her a car. Well, the next day, the next week, when it was time for Bible study, she showed up again and she was on the bus again. And they said, "What happened to your car?" And she said, "Well," she said, "you know, my boyfriend, we sold the car. He had always wanted a motorcycle, so we bought a motorcycle." The ladies were furious. I said, "Did she ask you for a car?" They said, "No." I said, "Why did you think she needed a car?" And they said, "Well, because we have cars." I said, "You know what? The young lady knew a couple things that you didn't know. Number one, she understood she didn't have the resources for that vehicle, okay? Talk just a minute with me. I say talk to your neighbor quite a bit, but we'll do this kind of, you can call it out. What are all the resources you have to have a car? Insurance, what else? Gasoline, what else? Yeah, I mean tires, maintenance. And I said the young lady knew something else you didn't know. She knew a couple hidden rules that operate in poverty you didn't know about. And one of the hidden rules in poverty is that if you have money or you have a vehicle, you have to share it. In fact, and it doesn't matter if they have a DWI or whatever, if you have to share it. And she knew that would buy her even more trouble. So she thought that by telling you she did it for a relationship, her boyfriend, that you would understand. You see, part of any kind of reality, any environment shapes thinking. And poverty and middle class and wealth, just like race, you experience it first at a very personal level and it shapes your thinking. I know this gentleman, he's a COO of a major company in San Antonio. He grew up very poor in the barrio, Hispanic, his mother, 4 sisters, and the father was not there. And he tells this story. When he was 7 years old, he had a paper route, and on that paper route there was a bicycle, and he really wanted the bicycle. But the bicycle was $40. So every week when he got paid, he kept $1 for himself, and he gave the rest of his money to his mother. Well, he had $40 saved. He came home from school one day to buy his bicycle, and the money was gone. And he went into his mother, and he said, "Have you seen my money?" And she said, "Yes, Al, I took it." He said, "You took it?" He said, "Yes, your sister was very ill. You were the only one who household had any money." He said, "Without that money, she would have died. I took her to the doctor and bought medicine." Well, the next year in 3rd grade, his teacher was talking about math and why you need to understand math. And if you understand math, you can count your money and you can get ahead and you can save your money. He said, "I still remember thinking to this day, that teacher is an absolute idiot." Okay? If she is so stupid, she doesn't know what happens to your money when you save it. Then she probably doesn't understand math either, and I'm not going to learn that from her either, okay? And he didn't, okay? And that is the issue around the thinking that occurs in different classes. You do not think the same way in poverty that you do in middle class, that you do in wealth, because how you spend your time is a different knowledge base. We talk a lot about privilege being about race, and it is. We talk about privilege being about social access, and it is. We talk about privilege being about money, and it is. But a huge form of privilege is knowledge. It's about the intergenerational transfer of knowledge. They just did a study with 8,500 children in Australia. They followed them from in vitro till they were 14 years old. They found that they could accurately predict the verbal comprehension scores of 5-year-olds and the nonverbal reasoning scores of 14-year-olds based upon the maternal grandfather's occupation. Take a minute and talk with your neighbor. Why would it be maternal and why would it be the grandfather? Or why would it be occupation? I'm sorry. Why would it be the maternal grandfather and why would it be occupation? Take a minute and talk with your neighbor. Why would it be the mother? Well, they give language, okay, to a child. Why would it be occupation? It's about stability. The more stable an environment, the more able you are to devote time to learning. So this is a very cognitive approach to class and the issues around how you begin to think about where you are. It's not that one is better than another, it's just that the thinking is different. And most of the churches and institutions and schools and work operate off middle class norms. And so it's a huge kind of a jump. This gentleman in San Antonio, who's the COO, he said this to me. He said, Ruby, when you grow up in poverty, you grow up in a foreign country, and nobody explains the rules to you. And so that's what we're going to talk about, how that works. I want to stop now and answer a question that I know is bothering just about everybody in this room, and that's where'd she get her accent, okay? So a whole bunch of you are betting I'm Cajun, okay? And you would be wrong. So let me just say this. I was born in Indiana and grew up in Ohio, and then I lived in Virginia, and then I lived in Indiana, and then I lived in Corpus Christi, Texas, then Chicago, Illinois, then Houston, Texas, and now Corpus Christi again, and moved back and forth between the South and the Midwest. And when I first started doing this, people write on their evaluations, you know, you talk too fast and you cut off your sentences and you need to enunciate more clearly. People are so kind on their evaluations, okay? And so I've worked really hard on that, and now people think I'm Cajun. So I don't know what to tell you about that. And I want to say just briefly how this work got started, and then a little bit about what this means for the faith community and for your community sustainability and the well-being of America. I grew up Mennonite. And I know because many of you are with faith, you know what Mennonites are, okay? They're not Amish, okay? They don't drive the buggies, but they are kissing cousins. And I did get kicked out, okay? Just in case you were wondering, okay? But I went to Mennonite College and they required you live in a third world country for a trimester. So I lived in Haiti, down in the Caribbean for 3.5 months to study poverty and service. And while I was down there, I met a wealthy Italian aristocrat, so I studied wealth too. You know, you study what's available, okay? Yeah, and he was, okay? Yeah. And then I came back and met my former husband, to whom I was married for 30 years, and he grew up in extreme poverty. And when I met his neighborhood, and we lived right next to it for 8 years, I'd never seen people live that way, and I discovered real quickly it wasn't about intelligence. They were very, very smart. And then I wouldn't have thought anything about the neighborhood was mostly white. And then he took a bond job in the Chicago Board of Trade as a bond trader, and we were throwing in very wealthy people. And again, this group was mostly white. And I think it was because there were no racial differences that I couldn't attribute it to anything but differences in thinking and resource bases and what you had access to. So that's kind of how this work got started. But I want to talk now, what is it that the faith community can do? And one of the things is I'm going to recommend that you use a human capacity development model that creates resources, allows an individual to create their own resource base. Here's the key issue for communities in the United States right now. How do you address the needs of the under-resourced without negatively impacting the resourced? It's a huge issue. And what we basically said, even Apostle Paul in the Corinthians said, that our desire is not that others might be relieved while you are hard pressed, but that there might be equality. And so the issue is, how do you begin to look at this in a way that builds community sustainability? Well, the first thing that I want to talk about is this whole issue around information and relationships, because I have to say that everything is about information and relationships. What we find is if you want to transition, money alone does not do it. And we're going to talk about resources in a minute. But money does not build human capacity. And money does not change thinking. What money does is it gets you past survival. But the things that change your thinking are employment, education, and relationships with people different than you are. Social bridging capital, okay? And that's what really helps you change your thinking. I don't know if you know the research, but 80 to 90% of people in America who win the lottery, within 5 years, they're actually in worse financial shape than before they won, okay? So you knew there was a reason God wasn't answering your prayers. You just didn't know what it was. Well, one of the things that's happened in the United States over time is that we have moved from this whole concept of genetic determinism, who you are and what you could be is what you inherited, to the concept of social determinism. And social determinism really happened with the women's movement. The women's movement said, hey, it doesn't matter what you inherit. If you're not allowed to vote and you're not allowed to have property and you're not allowed to be educated, it doesn't really matter what you inherited. So it was about social access. So in the multicultural movement, particularly in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, a lot of social barriers were removed. Now, not all of them, but many of them, okay? There are many more to be removed. Well, what happened then is it was the system's fault. The system did bad things to you. Well, who is the system? The system is only as good as the information and relationships in the system. So as we started working with this, it became really clear that part of what you had to look at was how a person thinks about their reality and their environment. And so I'm going to call that cognitive determinism. And particularly with artificial intelligence research and the research on computers, we really started looking at how is it that thinking occurs. And there's a book I really recommend you called by Carol Dweck, D-W-E-C-K. She's the one who has very hard research on mindsets and how they really shape your thinking. In many ways, the greatest prison any of us lives in is in our own mind. And the question is, how do you begin to realize the prisons that you hold for yourself in your own mind? And so we began to look at what is this thinking? Well, information and relationships is about everything that you do. I'll give you this example. We'd been married. I'd been married to my former husband about a year, and I wanted to buy a house, okay? Well, he said, no, Ruby, we're not buying a house because when you own a house, when you buy a house, the bank owns you. And in generational poverty, that's true because of the interest rates and the way the agreements are written a lot of times. I said, no, my parents have always had property, and that's how you build an asset base. We're going to have a house. Well, we argued for a year, okay? Well, we bought a house. But before we did that, his mother went around and told everybody in the neighborhood, they said, that house is too expensive, that house is too expensive. You know what, they're going to lose that house and they're all going to move in with us. And then you know what, one of us will have to take them in. Okay? I said, no, we're not losing the house. Because what I knew that I didn't think to tell anybody was that you're allowed to have about 30% of your gross to be indebtedness, and we were only at 12%. But I didn't think to tell anybody that because I didn't know that people didn't know it, okay? Well, we bought the house. Well, a year and a half later, we sold it for 50% more than we paid for it. Within 2 years, they all went out and bought houses, okay? But it's that information and relationships. And then a very simple thing. When you grow up in poverty, you don't have tools. You don't know how to use them, okay? So we had a shrub in front of our mailbox that was growing, you know? And I said to him, we have to trim that shrub. And he said, well, Ruby, let me go to the library and get a book and read about how to do it. He had 4 years of college, you know. I said, okay. Well, meanwhile, the shrub was growing, okay? And a couple weeks later, I said, you know, we really need to trim that shrub. He said, well, yeah, all right, I'll go to the library and get a book, okay? Well, a couple more weeks later, the shrub's still growing, okay? You can hardly see the mailbox by now. And I said, so one day I went to the hardware store and bought a clipper, and I was out there cutting on that, and he said, Ruby, you don't know any more about this than I do. I said, no, I don't. And he said, give it to me, I'll do it, okay? So the thing is, he learned to repair things. And he said to me later, he said, Ruby, he said, I thought to use a tool, you had to have expert training in the tool. He said, I didn't know you could go just get one. And the bottom line is, it's the information and relationships. For those of you who are in the Christian religion, that is exemplified in the communion. Communion is a metaphor for information and relationships. Your human body is a DNA system, which is an information system. The relationships, and it forms the relationships in your body. When you do communion, the bread of Christ, that is about the physical relationships and information in the church. The blood of Christ, blood is always about spiritual, blood is always about the relationships in DNA, and this time it's about the spiritual. There are similar metaphors in the Jewish church, Jewish religion, and in the Muslim one. The bottom line is this: information and relationships. It's about what all communities are, what all churches are, what all organizations are. So they're only as good as the information and the relationships in that group of people. Well, they shape thinking. And one of the things that happens is that this is a cognitive model we're talking about. Because without capacity, without your own capacity, you don't have the ability to develop your own resource base. And so empowerment comes in part from your ability to do that. And to do that, you have to be able to think about it. And so one of the things we love about Getting Ahead is that it's a choice model. See, one of the reasons a lot of our social service models don't work is they're compliance models, and compliance models don't work. Compliance models do not build capacity, compliance models do not build love, and compliance models don't build discipleship. They don't build communities. I learned this the hard way. You know, I think one of the most humbling things any human being can have is to have a child who's significantly brighter than you are, okay? Because it's a daily reminder how limited you are. And my former husband had 3 siblings who had IQs over 150. He had a sister with a photographic memory. One time she did something and I said to him, I just don't understand why she did that. And he looked at me and he said, Ruby, of course you don't understand. He said, she answered all the tests, all the questions on the IQ test. He said they couldn't find a question she couldn't answer. He said, furthermore, Ruby, he said, she doesn't understand you and you don't understand her. He said, when she looks at you, it's like you look at somebody who's mentally handicapped. Well, thank you, okay? Thank you for sharing, okay? So anyway, well, when our son was 5 months old, he started talking, okay? Well, I ignored it because you're not supposed to be able to do that at 5 months old, okay? At 7 months old, he was on the bed one day and he said down, and I thought, well, isn't that clever? He can make a sound that I think is a word, okay? And I looked back at him and he went down, okay? Like you idiot, okay? Well, when he was 9 months old, he wasn't eating one day, and I sat him on the counter by the sink in the kitchen, and I said, you will eat these peaches, okay? I thought, I'm the adult here. Well, he ate the whole jar of peaches. As soon as it was empty, he looked me straight in the eye, he turned his head to the sink, he threw up the whole jar of peaches, turned around and looked me straight in the eye. And the message was really clear, okay? You can make me eat them, but you can't make me keep them, okay? And I remember hyperventilating on the spot, thinking I have another 18 years to live with you, okay? But I'm not sure I'm up to it. So the thing of it is that our social service models, they come into a social service agent and we give them a plan, and the problem is it's not their plan until it's your plan. So one of the things that Getting Ahead does is give them a knowledge base about themselves and the ability to have a future story and plan. Now, one of the things, I want to talk about a couple things that as you begin negotiating, moving from poverty to middle class or middle class to wealth, and when you start working with community sustainability, I want to talk briefly about this concept of hidden rules. Because the reason hidden rules become so important is hidden rules are what break relationships, okay? And hidden rules come out of environment. For example, how many of you have been to a new church and stood up at the wrong time? Okay, yeah. And the way you know you broke a hidden rule is the way people look at you, you know. They never say anything to you. They know they look at you like you look at something moving in a wastebasket, you know. They kind of go like that, okay. But we have them by religion, we have them by race, we have them by region of the country. I don't know if you know this, but if you go into ranching country in Colorado and you ask somebody how many head of cattle they have, they are offended. I mean, they will turn around and walk off a lot of times. Talk with your neighbor just a minute. Why would that question be so offensive in ranching country? Well, if you know how many head of cattle somebody has, you can know how much grazing land they need, and then you can calculate net worth, okay? Well, we have hidden rules, yeah, we have hidden rules by class too, but we don't think about them, and we don't articulate them. So I want to talk about some of these because they're huge, they break relationships. Like, I know a wealthy man in Corpus Christi, and he said this to me one day, Ruby, he said that, you know, he said, we only played golf with that guy one time because he didn't understand the rules. And he didn't mean he didn't understand the rules of golf. He meant what? He didn't understand the hidden rules of the situation. Well, they break relationships. And three things that you have to transition out of poverty are education, employment, and relationships with people different than you are because they give you new information, okay? And to develop those new relationships, you have to have this concept of hidden rules. And what we find breaks communities down is that the hidden rules are so different in wealth than they are in middle class than they are in poverty, that when you get all the players at the table, people get offended so easily that it's difficult to have a discussion. So let me tell you about some of these as we move. I'll just start with a simple one, food. We have hidden rules about food, okay? Like, for example, in poverty, food is very important because food's a line between being destitute and being poor, okay? And people will say, we were poor growing up, but we always had enough to eat. How many of you have heard that, okay? And so the issue around food in poverty is quantity, and the question after a meal is, are you full? Did you have enough, okay? The diet in poverty is very high in carbohydrates and fats, and one of the reasons is carbohydrates help your brain make serotonin, and serotonin keeps you from getting depressed, okay? That's why if you were on that South Beach diet for more than a week, you thought you're going to have to kill somebody, okay? Because your brain wasn't making any serotonin, okay? But in middle class, the issue around food is quality, and so after a meal, people will go, was it good? Did you like it? Okay. But in wealth, it's about presentation. Was it artistically presented? Did it go with the theme? Did it have aesthetic appeal? Okay. And I didn't know that hidden rule. And one of the bond traders' wives from Old Money got sick when we lived in Chicago. Now, middle class loves casseroles, okay? Because, you know, if you don't want to eat it right now, you can freeze it, okay? And I did not know that in wealth they don't eat casseroles, okay? And so I went upscale with a Pyrex bowl, you know, even, not one of those cheap throwaway tins, you know? And I had my name on the bottom of that bowl, okay, which she did not return, okay? Broke one of my hidden rules, okay? But I paid money for that bowl. All right, she took one look at it and she said, well, just put it in the kitchen. Well, she was so rude and I was so furious, and she was furious because I was so stupid, okay? And that's the thing about a hidden rule. The group that has the most money, or is the dominant culture, or has the most power, they believe their hidden rules are the best, and they're equated with intelligence, okay? Well, we have hidden rules about money, and probably this is the one that has killed welfare in America. I don't care where you go in the world, it's the same rules about money. And so one of the things that happens when churches start to do outreach is immediately members get furious about how money got spent, okay? So I want to spend, like my mother said to me, and I love her dearly, she's 85 now, she said to me, Ruby, we had those kids in the church, and you know what she said? They ate all the food out of the refrigerator, okay? I said, Mom, of course, they were hungry. She said, but they didn't ask permission first. One of the hidden rules, okay? I said, no, Mom, they're not going to, okay? The bottom line is that that's part of this hidden rules that you follow, and they're around money and time. And so, how many of you have worked with someone who they did not have money for food, but they had a brand new pair of Nikes? Okay. How many of you have been past a trailer and it's all beat up, but there's a brand new satellite dish in the yard? Okay. All right. How many of you have helped someone with their light bill and they're driving a new car? Okay. My point is this. How many of you, when you get paid, you pay for your things first? You know, your house payment, your car payment, your bills, okay? Well, next time you get paid, I need you to do your money just differently one time, okay? Go out and have a good time, okay? Now, if you're a minister, you're going to have to go a state over to do this next piece, okay? But cash your check at a bar, okay? Yeah. And when the world gets clear and you can see again, you see how much money you have, and the rest of the money you have, you cycle to next payday, okay? You wouldn't do that. And middle class has a couple rules about money. See, middle class makes their decisions against three things typically. They spend their time at work, on achievement, they go to school at night, and they buy things. That's what middle class does, okay? And they have a couple rules about money. One of them is this. I don't ask you for money, and what? And if you borrow, you got to what? But, and middle class has a rule about work. You don't quit your job until what? Bingo. Because you don't want to mess up your material security. But if you're in wealth, and you've been in wealth 2 generations, see, if we were being technical, go generational poverty, 2 generations or more, to situational, like situational is when there's a death, a divorce, illness, to middle class, to new money, which is about income, to old money, which is about connections. What happens when people are moving along this continuum? They use part of the rules they grew up with and part of the rules they're moving to. They don't think like the people they grew up with, but they don't think like the people they're moving to. Well, what happens if you've been in wealth 2 generations? You have a different problem. And there's so much reverse snobbery in the middle class about wealth, because the middle class doesn't understand what a huge issue personal safety is in wealth. You see, you have so much material security, you can't take care of it by yourself, so you have to have people help you. And that makes you vulnerable to personal safety level. You can't take care of a 15,000 square foot home yourself. And middle class says you shouldn't have a house that big, okay? But what wealth knows is that if they didn't have a house that big, they couldn't do the media and social connections and linkages they need to do, okay? So the thing of it is that in wealth, your decision is against your connections, your social, your financial, and your political connections, which leads to another hidden rule. When you go to a party among the very wealthy, you don't introduce yourself. Anybody know what happens if you do? Well, they'll turn around and walk off. You won't be acknowledged. But if you go to a party in the middle class and you don't introduce yourself, what are you? Snob. But let me explain. If you were wealthy, you do the same thing. Because it's how you know this person is safe. You are introduced. And they always say your name and your connection. So-and-so family, so-and-so firm. Not too long ago, I got in the back of a limo. And there was this stunningly beautiful African-American woman in the back of the limo, and she's very hesitant to speak. Now, usually when you get in the back of a limo, you're the only person there, okay? Well, it was a 45-minute ride back to the airport, so I struck up a conversation, sent her a book. Well, she gave me her address, her business address, and I sent her the book there. But when the thank you came back. It came back from a personal address, and I understood everything. What does it mean when you live in a major city and your address is one digit? Talk to your neighbor. What's that mean? Like, let me give you an example. One Trump Plaza. What's that mean? Yeah, it means you own the whole block. In fact, retailers say they know how much wealth is in a household by the number of digits in the address. I know you're all going to go home tonight and change your address, but the bottom line on the thing, yeah, I looked at the last name again. It's old money, African-American last name. But do you know what the problem was? We had never been introduced. And for all she knew, I managed to get in the back of the limo to meet her, okay? So you're very careful. And the rule about money is you just don't talk about the cost of an individual item. But if you've been in poverty, and you've been in poverty 2 generations, you have a different problem again. And your problem this time is you don't have material security, okay? My brother in Ohio, he has made the slide from middle class to poverty in 10 years, extreme poverty. Didn't take him 2 generations. The first thing that happened, he lost his farm. Significantly in debt when he did that, and then he bounced around for employment for a couple years because didn't have the skills for the jobs. And then I don't know during that time if they didn't buy birth control pills or they didn't use them, but they had a severely handicapped child, so severely handicapped that even though he's 14 now, he cannot feed himself. And so that knocked a wage earner out of the household. And then my brother got very sick. Only he didn't go to the doctor right away. Why not? And then happened, he now has a degenerative illness. It's so advanced it cannot be reversed. He cannot work anymore. In America, you have to be out of work for a year before you can show no income for a year before you can get disability. So I pay for where he lives. I give him money. Another sister gives him money. Another sister pays electricity, a brother gives him gas. We all got together and bought him a vehicle. And the bottom line is this: in poverty, you make your decisions against 3 things: daily survival, relationships, because people keep you alive. Work does not keep you alive, people do. And entertainment. Entertainment takes away the pain. And what happens is, that changes then. When people are your possession, that changes all the rules. And that's why a fight over a man or a woman is so intense in poverty. There's a disproportional amount of domestic violence in poverty. And one of the reasons is because that person is yours. We had a high school boy kill another high school boy in Houston after school hours because the boy he killed had given candy and flowers to his ex-girlfriend. And as far as he was concerned, she was still his. That's why in generational poverty, parents will often fear their children getting too educated. Because what do children do when they get too educated? They leave. And in poor white neighborhoods, they say you're getting above your raisins. In poor African American neighborhoods, they call them Oreos. In poor Hispanic neighborhoods, they call them coconuts. In poor Asian neighborhoods, they call them bananas. In poor Native American Indian neighborhoods, they call them apples. Red on the outside and white on the inside, but the issue's still the same. We're so afraid we're going to lose you. Situational poverty will encourage their children to be educated. Generational poverty is often equated with loss for this reason. Middle class worries when they get old that they won't have financial security. But what you worry about when you're old in generational poverty is that you will not have physical safety. And one of the reasons you want your children there is to help you with that. And what's the rule about money in poverty? Well, the rule about money is if I have any and you ask me for some, we got to share. That's how we'll stay alive. Well, take a minute and talk with your neighbor about these hidden rules. Have you ever seen them in practice? Take a minute and talk about that. Okay. Well, what happens then eventually is this. over time, over generations then, the knowledge is not transferred, because if over time there's not education, if over time there's not work, and generational poverty is characterized by intermittent work. In fact, there's a brilliant African-American sociologist, University of Chicago, his name is James Julius Wilson. He says this: if you want to destroy a culture, all you have to do is take work away from men, because it changes identity. And what happens over time is this: that generational poverty is characterized by intermittent work, okay? And what happens then is that it shifts how you interact with your environment. And what that does then is, over generations, make you unable to be a member of the community, because the rules are so different. Remember what Al Silva said, it's like you're in a foreign country. Well, what happens when you then no longer can work or could develop the resources, have access to resources, because the education, the understandings, the capacity, the knowledge bases you've not had quite that opportunity to have it be developed, and the ones you do have are to survive poverty, which is a very different knowledge base than to survive middle class. What happens then is that over time, you become dependent on others for resources. And so I'm going to talk about what human capacity means. What does this mean? And what is the charge to the faith community? Human capacity is the ability, first of all, to develop your own resource base. It's the ability to make choices that promote dignity, well-being, and development. It's the ability to give back to others. It's the ability to negotiate for your well-being without destroying others. And it's the ability to grow spiritually. And when we start looking at resource bases, that's human capacity. Well, what we see over time in communities is this. What happens, there's something in a community called what I call a radar. And there are things that happen below that radar that people don't notice for a long time, because there aren't enough people involved in it. There's a man out of California, Paul Safro, the Institute of the Human Future, he says this, that it takes 20 to 25 years to become an overnight success, okay? And what we see in communities is this: it takes 20 to 25 years till you get critical mass, and you have to have critical mass in something before it shows up above the radar. For example, when I go into a community, critical mass in social phenomena is somewhere around 35, 40, 45%, because when 40% of people buy into an idea, you have 1 out of 3, you have almost 1 out of 2, and it starts to get above the radar. Well, when I go into a community and they have 10% poverty, I say, do you have any poverty in this community? And they'll go, no, Ruby, we don't have any. I'll say, do you have 20%? When it gets to be 20%, they'll say, well, we have a few. All right, it's 1 out of 5. When it gets to be 30%, I'll say, do you have any? And they'll go, oh, we got a few pockets. When it gets to be 40%, they'll call the office, they're frantic, and they say they just came overnight, okay? No, they didn't. It's now above the radar, okay? And what happens when things get above the radar? Communities get in turmoil. And let me explain why. The top 10% of your community in terms of income and resources pay 75% of the taxes in your community. The bottom 50% pay 4% of federal taxes. What happens is this: when it gets to be 40%, what we see in communities is a huge demand on social services. We see a huge demand on the hospitals, a huge demand on the police departments, a huge demand on schools, because there becomes more issues, more people who need resources that they can't develop themselves. Well, what happens then is communities get really anxious between that 40 and 60%. But we find that when communities get to be 60% poor, what does the top 10% of the population do? They move. And what do they take with them when they leave? Exactly, their resources. Paul Safro at the Institute for the Human Future says this, that in the next 20 years, communities will either become feral or thriving. Feral, he means they'll be domesticated and go back to the wild, okay? Or thriving. And really, the issue for many communities is how do you begin to deal with the growing issue of supporting the under-resourced while you deal with the resourced. Well, let me say this, you have to provide human capacity because at some point in time, you have to provide knowledge bases and relationships because eventually you can't have a small percent of the population providing resources for the whole population. Do you follow me? It's not sustainable. So how do you go about that, doing that? And I want to talk about that. Basically, one of the places we got this human capacity development model from Jesus, from Muhammad, from Moses, they all did the same thing. They did this. They did two things. They went to their people and said, I'm going to develop, let me tell you how you can take care of yourself, have your own salvation. I'm going to tell you that knowledge base. And they said, they always had a set of disciples or followers who helped develop capacity in others. Those two things, information and relationships, they make all the difference in the world. And they're always choice models. You can ask, seek, find, you can believe, they're all there. And so when we start looking at this whole piece on human capacity, what we know is that you want to develop relationships with people different than you are, and there's no better place to do that than churches and faith community, because the resources in a faith community are absolutely unbelievable. And so what we do is pull that there so that we can have community sustainability. That's what Getting Ahead does. It gives the knowledge and the information basis. And what we do when we do Getting Ahead and when we build community sustainability, we say this. People who have resources, they need to understand the reality of poverty and what it's like to live in it. So we give them that knowledge base and the hidden rules. For the people in poverty, we say, we want to tell you, say this, we think you're a problem solver because you have to be. You solve problems every day. But we don't think you have the same knowledge and information bases that other people have. And so we provide that for them. And that allows you then to be contributing members in a community. As I've talked about some of the hidden rules, this human capacity model, why you need choice, okay? And then I want to kind of say a couple more things and say one other huge piece in the transition from poverty to middle class. It has to do with an abstract representational reality. And I want to talk about this yet and then open it up for questions, okay? You see, one of the things, if you read the books and you know about them, you know that you have different amounts and different kinds of language in poverty than you do in if you're educated. It's called formal register and casual register. And one of the things that happens is that you have a lot more words in formal register. One of the things we know is that even if you grew up in extreme poverty, if you were a member of a religious community and participated, you have formal register. If you were not a member of a religious community, the research is that by 2 generations, you don't have formal register. So all the textbooks, all the written documents, you don't understand them. Let me give you an example. When I first started my business, I hired a man who was out of poverty to be my manager. And he wouldn't follow the handbook, okay? Because you know, the handbooks that you have in your company. We had an employee that was having difficulty with the concept of clothing, okay? She was opposed to it. And it was creating a lot of difficulty in the company, okay? Particularly with the boys in the warehouse. And then she downloaded porn and clogged the network, okay? So I said to him, we have to write her up. That is a violation of our handbook. He said, Ruby, those are just words on paper. I said, no, they represent behaviors, okay? I said, they represent behaviors. And I said, it's a legal document for us. We have to follow it. He said, nah, they're just words on paper, and she didn't mean it. I said, it doesn't matter whether she meant it or not. She did it, okay? And we've explained to her why she can't, so you have to write her up. And finally I said, you have to choose. If you're going to work for me, you're going to write her up. If not, you have to go. But he couldn't understand that words could represent behaviors. Let me give you another example. It enters into the workforce tremendously, this language thing. And I'm going to clean this story up for you a great deal. But I worked for, see, one of the things in the school business, just let me give you a school story before I give you a work story. One of the things in the school business is a lot of kids get kicked out of school simply because they're using the wrong language. They don't know it. They don't know any other language. So one of the things we do in the school business is we teach kids how to translate, okay? Like this little kid, he's 6th grader, he told the teacher that something sucked, okay? So he had to find 2 ways to say sucked correctly, okay? And what we tell them is there's a way to say it like a newscaster says it or the way a friend says it, okay? Well, his first translation was, I don't like this work. And we said, well, that's a good one, but you have to have another one. He was quiet for a minute, and this was his second translation. There is no longer any joy in this activity. And let me just say that here's a workplace example. So many people, adults, get fired in the workplace just over this language thing. We hired a young lady, and she was wonderful on the computer, and she had enough formal register to get the job. But when she got mad, she went back to casual and intimate, okay? And I'm going to clean this up for you. There were a bunch of MFs in here and everything else, okay? But one of the senior secretaries insulted her over her clothing, and it was inappropriate. Well, she knew she'd been insulted. She said, how dare you say that to me? You can't talk to me that way. Nobody talks to me that way. She said, I'll tell you what. You come outside right now, and we'll take care of it right now. Come on, come on. Well, the senior secretary who insulted her ran back to her boss and said, she threatened my life, okay? So they called her into the human resources, wrote her up, said she used that language again, threatened somebody's life again, she'd be fired. Well, she wasn't my secretary, but she came to me, she said, Ruby, it's just not fair. She said, it's discriminatory here. She said, you know what? She said, she started it, I got in trouble, she didn't, and it's just not fair. And I said, well, you know, that is true, but she insulted you in formal register, and at work, that's an asset, okay? You came back at her in casual and intimate, and you threatened her life, and you just can't do that at work, okay? She said, well, are you telling me I have to live with this? I said, no, 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 you just insult her back in formal register, okay? She said, I don't know how to do that, so I gave her some phrases, okay? That's a lovely dress, it accentuates your hips, you know, stuff like that. She got to have some skills, you know. The bottom line is you have to have a way to deal with that environment, okay, so that you have dignity, you have an understanding of it. And then it shows up in law enforcement. And I don't know if you know this, but 70% of individuals in prison come out of poverty. And I'll give you an example. My son didn't have his driver's license a month, so he got stopped by law enforcement in Baytown. And we've always told him be polite, and he was. And the officer, he had 3 boys in the car. It was 8 o'clock at night. And the officer said, young man, what are you doing? He said, well, sir, I'm taking my friends home. He said, do you know why I stopped you? He said, no, sir, I do not. He said, well, the officer said, it's 8 o'clock at night. It's dusk, and you don't have your lights on. And he said, I'm sorry, sir, and he turned on his lights. And in spite of all that, he got a $200 fine. Now contrast that with an adolescent from poverty who only has casual register. And casual register has half the words of formal register. And it doesn't have any abstract words in it. See, I'll finish, I'll say this in a minute. So the officer says to the young man, what are you doing? And what's the young man going to say? Nothing. How's the officer going to interpret that? Evasive and disrespectful. So the officer's going to change his nonverbals, and in poverty you pay attention to nonverbals first because they tell you a person's intent. So he's watching the nonverbals and he realizes that was not the right response, so he's going to make a joke. Now let me explain why you use humor to de-escalate conflict. When you don't have formal register, you do not have the words to resolve a conflict. What they will tell you in conflict resolution is to resolve a conflict, you have to go away from the personal to the issue. And all those issue words are in formal register. I heard a husband and wife one time in this neighborhood, they argued for 15 minutes about who the cat loved the most. What they were really arguing about was who was most lovable, but neither of them had the words to argue at that level, so it became very personal, okay? And so he's going to make a joke because it's how he's going to de-escalate the conflict. How's the officer going to interpret that? Even more disrespectful. He's going to go to an aggressive stance. The young man is going to go to his next backup strategy, which is in poverty. You're not respected unless you're personally tough, because you can't survive poverty unless you are tough, okay? So he's going to say, hey man, you got no right to stop me. And what's going to happen? He's going to get arrested because in part the words weren't there. He couldn't even start the conversation with language. It's a huge asset base, and it's an asset base that you get in church. Even if your household has very little money, you can get language in church. The faith community has all the resources, and so that's what I want to go back to as we finish here. The faith community has all the resources, and these are the resources: financial, emotional, mental, spiritual, physical, support systems, relationships and role models, knowledge of hidden rules, and language. All those things are available through the faith community. You know, we have in America made this huge mistake of thinking that wealth is about money. Wealth is not about money. It's only one of 8 resources. And what we find, incidentally, is that that is the one resource that if you have all the others, you can live very well without. Do you follow me? Because you have the rest of the resources. And so as I close here, I want to close with this, open it up to questions, but I want to close with this verse out of Matthew. When Jesus said, "For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Many, many people, when they read that, they interpret it at the physical level. But I believe Jesus also meant it at the cognitive level. He said, you were hungering for information, thirsting for knowledge, providing social capital, a stranger. You provided comfort and support. You were sick, emotional well-being. You gave belonging and identity, which is clothing is always about belonging and identity. And you gave new ideas, no longer imprisoned, so that you could live a different way. And it's a gift that simply cannot be underestimated that you provide. Getting Ahead is 15 weeks of that an individual from poverty will go through that gives them the language and the knowledge base about themselves. We teach about money, we teach about hidden rules, how wealthy, middle class, and poor think differently, how the system hurts and helps them. We talk about language, we talk about resource bases. One of the things the participants do is they analyze their own resource base, and then we have them analyze the resource base in the community, and then they make a future story and a plan. You see, without a future story, I was working with this 18-year-old boy, and I said to him, "Tell me what your life will be like when you're 25. And he said, "I'll be dead." And I said, "How do you know that?" And he said, "Everybody like me is dead." If you believe you're going to be dead at 25, then there's no point in doing well in school, and there's no point in working. I did this long research study with women in poverty and women in wealth and women in middle class. And women in middle class will respond to a paper pencil survey, but women in wealth and women in poverty will not, for different reasons. Women in wealth will not do it because of privacy issues. Women in poverty will not do it because of the paper pencil kind of nature of the task. But what we found is that when we interviewed women in wealth, without exception, they would talk over and over again about plans and choices and plans and choices. When we talked to women in poverty, those two words never, ever, ever showed up anywhere in the conversation. What we did is we pay people in poverty to learn. And let me tell you why this is a very important concept. We pay them to come for 15 weeks, 2 hours at a time, and they get paid to come. And the reason is this: we tell them that learning is important. Corporations pay their people to learn. We will pay you to learn. And they get a living wage for each hour they're there. And we give it to them on a Walmart card or a gift card or a grocery coupon, and then that's theirs and they take it home. Well, what happens is they learn. They learn about themselves. One of the things that never happens in poverty is that because there's less language in generational poverty, I could tell you the hard research on it. They just did hard research in Kansas City. They found that a 3-year-old in a professional household has more language than an adult in a welfare household, okay? And so what basically the thing is this: there's never any conversation in poverty about who you are as a human being and what your strengths and weaknesses are. So we give them that knowledge base about themselves, their resource base, how you develop resource bases. Then the circles part of it is we hook them up with an ally, and they are circles leaders, and they choose 4 people who have gone through Bridges training, which is for people who are middle class or wealthy who want to know about poverty. And what happens is they become allies, and the person who went through getting ahead becomes a circle leader. And they have the right to choose people who want to be their allies for the next 2 years. And allies are sometimes circle leaders who say, well, I need somebody who knows about accounting, I need a teacher in my mix, I need somebody from law enforcement in my mix, people who understand things. And then the circle leaders call these people together once a month or twice a month and meet with them and discuss issues they're having, okay? And they get mentoring and advice and access to knowledge bases. And then in return, we ask the circle leader to give back and volunteer to the community in some fashion so that they become a contributing member of the community. And so what it is, many, many of the allies come out of the faith community. And what we find is it's in that dialogue, it's in that one-on-one relationships. Again, it's information and relationships. That's all it is, okay? That's all it is. It's information about yourself, your thinking, your environment, how you negotiate it, different choices you have, and then it's the relationship, the one-on-one relationship. It makes all the difference in the world.